Hi, today class we will be discussing Opa Mana. Opa Mana is the third pramana according to Nyaya philosophy. As you know that Nyaya philosophy believes in 4 pramanas. Pramanas means the sources of valid knowledge, and today class we will be discussing the third pramana known as Opa Mana or comparison. What they mean here in case of third pramana is that you compare these two things with their similarity or dissimilarity or peculiar quality, the knowledge that you gain, that will be known as the valid knowledge or prama. For example, to identify a particular object, somebody has given some opinion, and based on that opinion, if you compare the object which you have not seen earlier and the knowledge that you gain after comparing that object, this will be known as Opa Mana. All the discussion in details we will be doing in this class today. Opa Mana is divided into 2 words, Upa and Mana. Upa is similarity and Mana is a cognition. Through the similarity, what we cognize towards an object is known as Opa Mana. I will give an example which helps you to understand what really Opa Mana is, and based on that example we will be moving further. Consider a case, a person does not know an animal known as gabagai, but he knows only the word gabagai. Now he as a person or as a cognizer wishes to know about what this word stands for, or the gabagai is a word, what it stands for and what it refers to. Now for searching for that object or knowledge, he takes the suggestion or receives some kind of authoritarian statements from the forest person who knows which animal is known as gabagai. Then whenever the cognizer asks that person, could you explain which gabagai and how I will be identify that animal or object is gabagai, then the forest person will be explaining to that cognizer saying that gabagai will having the so and so many features, is look like a country cow. Here he is saying that there are 2 things is important here. The first thing is that the forest person or the forester knows that the cognizer understands the word cow and what it denotes for and what are the features of the cow. Now based on this understanding, the forester explains to that cognizer saying that gabagai is an animal similar to the cow. However, in a gabagai you find some kind of other features which is not found in case of a cow. So after listening all the description from the forester, the cognizer in a later period come across an animal looks like a cow. However, that animal, all the features of that animal may not be similar with the cow. In addition to that, he confirms with the description made by the forester on the term gabagai. Now as a cognizer, he brings all the information through his memory and impose all this description towards an object which is presented before him or her. So as a cognizer, if he finds that all the description made by the authoritative person or the forester is finding in that object or an animal which is presented before him, then his knowledge will be turned into valid. That means he or she can say that now I cognize an animal known as gabagai, and henceforth you find that 3 features of a valid knowledge will be satisfying here. One is asamdigdha, your cognition is decisible, you are conformed to your cognition. Then yathartha, that means truthfulness. Here truthfulness means all the descriptions made by the forester you will find the same kind of features to that animal which is presented before you. In other words, all the features described by the forester is conformity to the object which is presented before you, known as gabagai. Then the third component is anubhava, is a presentational in character. Here the cognizer able to identify that object with a particular name with so and so description made by the forester, because as a cognizer he finds the object which is presented before him or her. And the last, if the cognizer able to examine that or find that all the features described by the forester on a term Gabbagai and he finds all the features on that animal which is presented before him or her, then only his knowledge will be turned into a valid knowledge or prama. So now you can understand that how Opa Mana stands as a pramana to achieve a valid knowledge is known as prama. So this is the example. Whenever we will discuss further and further, I will refer to this example so that based on this example you can understand the Nyayical standpoint on pramana and how they really considers Opa Mana as a valid pramana to have a prama. Now according to them, according to Nyaya philosophy, they said that Opa Mana is the third method of valid knowledge or the third pramana. It is derived from two words, one is Upa and another is Mana. It is two words, if you put together in Sanskrit, then you will get the word Opa Mana. He is saying that Upa means similarity and Mana means cognition. And because of the similarity, whatever the cognizer is able to cognize an object is nothing but called Opa Mana. Because of the similarity, the cognizer is able to find that the Gavagai appears to be cow, however it is not same as cow. So because of here the similarity, the cognizer able to get a new idea on a particular object or identify an object which he did not know about that object earlier. So therefore here you find that knowledge will be turned into a valid or your identification on a particular object will be turned into valid by the help of similarity, by the help of comparison. Therefore in this case Nyayikas consider comparison as a valid source of knowledge. Further I said it is the source of our knowledge about the relation between a word and its denotation. That means the Gavagai he knows the word but he does not know what it refers to. But after the cognition is over, the cognizer finds that all the description made by the forester is finding in case of that Gavagai, and henceforth the knowledge he accumulates on the term Gavagai will be valid one. That means now he realized that the Gavagai as a word denotes to an object with having so and so features, and it is satisfying asamdigdha yathartha anubhava, these three conditions to have a valid knowledge. So in this way they consider Opa Mana, like perception and inference, is an independent pramana for having a prama or valid knowledge. The explanation they have given by the writing a sloka you find in Nyaya Sutra. That is, they have written Prasiddha Sadhyarmayat Sadhya Sadhanam Upamanam. Prasiddha means, as you know, that which you have known already earlier. Now we will see in the next slide how they have explained this sloka, which is found in case of Nyaya Sutra. NS means Nyaya Sutra 1.1.6. What they said is that Prasiddha Sadharmayat, what they mean, through similarity to a known object. Prasiddha means which you have already experienced, which you have already know it. Then Sadharmayat means through a similarity. Here if I refer to my example, then I will say that you are familiar to an object or an animal known as cow. You know all the features of the cow and you can identify Gavagai as a different animal similar to cow because you have a previous knowledge of cow, which some of the features of the cow certainly find in case of a Gavagai. And because of your previous knowledge and similar to the unknown object, you could able to identify that object with its true nature. The second point they say Sadhya Sadhanam, that means the making known of the things posited. That means the object which is presented before you, cognize it which is a particular name having a particular word because of the description made by the forester, and in addition to that you had a previous experience on the similar kind of object, though it is not exactly the same object. Therefore they said that it is because of your previous knowledge and the explanation who knows about that name Gavagai with his or her description and your previous knowledge, you compare to an object which is presented before you, and because of the similarity of your previous knowledge you could identify a particular object or particular animal which is presented before you having a different name. So they say that any knowledge a cognizer will get, certainly it is a new knowledge for him or her, therefore Opa Mana is an independent source of valid knowledge. They said A comparison, Opa Mana is another name, is a comparison, because you compare your previous knowledge cow towards another object which is presented before you, it is not known to you. You will be knowing that object is a phrase by the help of two things. First, by the help of the similar object, similar kind of object you had experienced in the past. The second thing is that about that new object, an authoritative person made certain kind of description on that object. So because of these two things, you could able to identify as a cognizer towards a new object. So this is called Opa Mana according to Nyaya philosophy. They said comparison is a knowledge of a thing through its similarity to another thing previously well known. I repeat, further they said comparison is a knowledge of a thing or an animal or an object through its similarity to another thing previously well known. What they means, if at all we identify an object having a name, or if at all we are identifying an animal having a name gabagai, it is because of our previous knowledge about the cow, because the gabagai is an animal similar to the cow. Then they made the statement saying that the consequences of distinct knowledge is called Opa Mana. What is that consequences? The first, the cognizer have an urge to know about certain object, about certain animal which denotes in a particular word. The second thing, the second point, as he is a cognizer, as he wishes to cognize a new object, wants to know something new, then he finds out some authoritative person who is familiar to that kind of object or that kind of animal, who has agreed to describe about that animal to the cognizer. And the cognizer certainly do not have any kind of disputes or enmity to the person who knows the new object. After listening the description from the person who knows about that object or an animal, he finds that the person who make a description said that this object, the object you are searching for, certainly it has a similarity towards some other object which is known to you or which you had known in your previous experiences. Now as a cognizer, you listen from him. Now you accumulate all the expression, you understand the expression made by the authoritative person. Then all this information you store in your mind. In a later period, when you encounter the similar kind of animal which is described by the authoritative person, you retrieve all the information what the person describes, and also your previous knowledge of that similar kind of animal, cow, and all the information you impose on an object which is presented before you, known as gabagai. Because here you find that gabagai is a new knowledge, and this is to be attained or achieved because of your previous knowledge which is similar to cow. In addition to that, the new description on a new object made by the authoritative person. So the consequence will be depend on the cognizer. If the cognizer could not able to retrieve all the information made by the authoritative person on a particular unknown object for the cognizer, and in addition to that, if at all the cognizer may not able to find out some of the similarity features like a cow what he had experienced in the past, then it is very difficult for him to cognize a new object known as gabagai. Thus they said, technically speaking, comparison means relation between a word and its meaning, because whenever we say gabagai, it denotes an animal similar to cow. However, all the features of cow you may not find on that animal known as gabagai. So this is the way Nyaya defines what is Opa Mana. Now if you remember the example I have given, how a cognizer cognizes a new object known as gabagai by the help of his or her previous knowledge on cow, because the authoritative person describes that gabagai is similar to cow. However, some or other unique features you find in case of gabagai. So now we will see that what are the steps involved for having a correct Opa Mana, for having a valid pramana or valid Opa Mana. The first step would be, we have authoritative statement that a word or a name denotes object of a certain description. Here the forester would like to describe on the animal gabagai on which the cognizer wishes to know about that object. The second, when one observes any such object, he has the knowledge that it answers to the given description. That means the cognizer, after listening from the forester, in the later period or in say after some time, if the cognizer find an animal satisfying all the description made by the forester, then the cognizer now finds that this is certainly a new object for him or her. Therefore, in the third step, as a cognizer, he has to recollect all the description statement received from the authority. The last step, it is depend on the cognizer. There is a resulting knowledge that this kind of object is denoted by the word is same. I repeat, so that you can have a clarification of the 4 steps. The first step saying that a person, a cognizer, wish to know on a certain object which is not known to him or her. Because of he has a urge to know, he find out some reliable person or a authoritative person who is familiar to that object and can explain to him about that object. Here the authoritative person, while explaining about that object, he said that that object is similar to some other object which is already known to the cognizer. Now, in a later period, the cognizer, whenever he or she finds that some kind of object fetch or match to the description made by the authoritative person, and in the past experience he had similar kind of object, then he immediately recollect all the information both in past as well as the authoritative person described on that object, recollecting all the information imposed on that object which is presented before him or her. Therefore, the resulted cognition will be known as valid cognition. If all the information imposed on that object find in that object, then the knowledge that generates or the knowledge that accumulates by the individual will be judged as Opa Mana or will be known as Opa Mana. But if he does not find any kind of similarity over there, then he cannot attain the true knowledge of the term Gabagai. If he cannot do that, the Asamdigdha, Yathartha and Anubhava, the 3 conditions won't be satisfied to have a valid Prama. Now we will see what are the Pramanas and what are the sources involved for having Opa Manas to be a valid knowledge. A statement made by the trustworthy or reliable person, it is a Sabda. Whenever the person describes about that fact, the cognizer hears that. As you know that perception is not limited to visual organs only. He is saying that perception will be known through our 6 sense organs and most specifically 5 sense organs. If you hear something, that means it is a perception for us, it is a hearing perception. If you smell something, that is also a perception, because after smelling, if you cognize an object, this will be according to Nyaya, you can treat this knowledge as a perceptual knowledge, because sense organs is involved here for cognizing an object. Therefore, they said in case of Opa Mana, you find a statement made by the trustworthy person is known as Sabda. The cognizer hears the sounds utterances from the authoritative person. The second step, the cognition of similarity, is a perceptual. That means in a later period, the cognizer encounter the similar kind of object which is made in conformation to the description made by the authoritative or trustworthy person. So, it is a kind of perceptual. Here it is a visual perception. If you see that, if you take in a true spirit, the cognizer having everything all with him, he is a healthy being and all the sense organs functions well, then you find that here the cognizer perceive that object which is presented before him or her in conformation to the description made by the trustworthy person. The third point, recollecting the description. Now he is consciously recollecting all the description made by the trustworthy person, and it is because of the smriti, the memory. The resulted cognition generated through the individual himself and herself. If he finds that or if she finds that all the information given by the or all the description made by the trustworthy person are found in case of that animal which is presented before him or her, then any knowledge that a cognizer will gain is known through the upamana, which will be considered as a valid pramana. Hope now it is clear what is upamana according to Nyayaka's standpoint. Now, therefore, they said that if these are the steps involved, if there are 4 steps involved for having an upamana knowledge, then which steps will be more important in case of Nyayaka's? That means, if you ruled out that step, we cannot consider the knowledge that the cognizer will gain will be turned into pramana or a source of valid knowledge. I repeat, the question arises here, if there are steps involved for having an upamana, then which steps will be more important? Without that, we cannot consider the knowledge that we gain will be known through upamana. In other words, I put it in this way, which steps will be known as the proximate cause or very important. Without that, we cannot gain any kind of valid knowledge through the upamana. Here there are 2 views you find, one is Prachina Nyaya, another is Nabya Nyaya. Prachina Nyaya said it is the first step, whereas the Nabya Nyaya said it is the second step. Prachina Nyaya said it is the first step. What is the first step? That the authoritative person or the trustworthy person describes about an unknown object to the cognizer by explaining that this object is similar to some object which is known to the cognizer. So, here the description is important. They said that if the trustworthy person unable to describe, or if the trustworthy person does not wish to describe on that unknown object to the cognizer at any situation or any conditions could not able to recognize that object even in later period. So, therefore, for them the first step where the trustworthy person describes about the unknown object is much more important, and without that any knowledge that cognizer will gain cannot be considered as a upamana. Counteracting to this view, you find that the Nabya Nyaya, they said that it is the second step. What they mean is that it is the cognizer when he recollect all the information and perceive that object and imposing all the features on that object and finding the conformity through the similarity, this will be termed as the essential steps for having a upamana. By counteracting to the old Nyayaka's view, they said that although the trustworthy person make a description about the unknown object, if the cognizer not able to perceive the similar kind of object in conformity to the description made by the trustworthy person, then the cognizer even cannot have a valid knowledge about that object which stands for Gavagai. Therefore, they said that it is not the first step, rather the second step is involved, or it's a proximity cause, it is the karana, or it is the important cause. Without that, upamana cannot be considered as a valid pramana, or any knowledge the cognizer will get cannot be turned into prama or valid knowledge. So, therefore, you find that there are 2 views in Nyayaka itself, one is Prachina Nyaya view, another is Nabya Nyayaka's view. Now, classifications of upamana. Now, we will see that upamana is talked about similarity, and there are steps we have discussed. Now, we will say that how many kinds of similarity we have, or how many types of upamana we have. As a result, we can have a valid upamana to have a prama. They said that upamana need not be always based on similarity. Upamana is of 3 kinds. Now, you have understanding what is similarity made by Nyayakas. Now, how they are explaining more and more on upamana, and what are the things they are incorporating in the domain upamana to have a valid knowledge. They said that upamana need not be always based on similarity. Upamana is of 3 kinds. That means, to have a upamana, to have a comparison, to have a knowledge, a valid knowledge through upamana, we need not to talk about only similarity, or it need not to depend on only similarity. So, it will depend on in similarity, in dissimilarity, and in peculiar qualities. So, therefore, they said that Opa Mana is of three kinds. Now, similarity I have described to you. Now, you know how a cognizer cognize an object or an animal known as gabagai, which is not known to him or her. This is a similarity. Because of the similarity, we cognize an object gabagai in relation to the cow, because some sort of features in cow we find in case of a gabagai. Now, this is understood to you. Now, we will be talking about dissimilarity and peculiar qualities. How dissimilarity and peculiar qualities both are to be considered under the Opa Mana. In case of dissimilarity, you find that the description made by the trustworthy person will be very clear enough. The trustworthy person will say that unlike lion and dogs, elephant have a trunk. Unlike lions and dogs, elephants have trunk. That means whenever you enter to a forest in a later period, you find that there is an animal which will be more bigger than the lion and tiger. However, the animal have a trunk. So, because of here the dissimilarity feature, you could able to identify the object with its true nature. In case of peculiar qualities, what they said is that it is sometimes also because of the peculiar qualities the cognizer able to cognize that object, which is a part of similarity. An example I will give so that it helps you to understand. For example, if I say that you do not know what squirrel is or what the word squirrel stands for. Now, as I am familiar with that object, you come to me and ask. Therefore, I will say, as a trustworthy person or reliable person to you, I will say that squirrel like mouse. However, the peculiar feature of the squirrel is that you find stripes on his body. So, then you in a later period or after some time you find some kind of animal like a mouse, however, there are some stripes on his body. Then because of my description of a peculiar qualities towards that animal, towards that object, you immediately know that that object which is not known to you, now you have known with a particular name known as squirrel, and having the so and so features which is conformity to the trustworthy person as well. So, therefore, they said that Opa Mana is of three kinds. One is based on similarity, another second one is based on dissimilarity, and third one is based on peculiar qualities. I will explain further. In case of similarity, I say that sadhyarma Opa Mana, that means something similar to that object which you want to cognize further with a different name. Now, I will give an example of similarity deviating from gabagai and cow. I said that crow and jackdaw. You know what crow means. Crow is a bird with so and so features. But certainly, assume a situation that you do not know what the word jackdaw stands for, what the word jackdaw refers to. Therefore, you came to me and believing me as trustworthy person, you listen to me. Then I said that you will find some kind of bird which is having big feather but look like a crow having black in color. You find also the feather sometimes red in the corner side. So, now in your later period you find there is a bird appears to be crow, however, it is not look like a crow because its shape is huge, and also if you find some red color in his feather in some corner. Then you conclude that because of your similarity feature, what I have said in relation to crow, you could able to identify that object with a particular name. Here your knowledge about the jackdaw will be a valid one, because the knowledge you have gained it is because through the Opa Mana. The explanation I have given here, in this case we start from the description of an unknown object given in terms of its similarity to a well known object by some authoritative person. Now, coming to the second point, dissimilarity. As I said to you, the dissimilarity, unlike lions and dogs, elephants have trunks. Now, what Nyaya defines here is that in this case, in case of dissimilarity, the objects denoted by a word are described in terms of their contrast or dissimilarity to some well-known object of experience. The trustworthy person explains to that cognizer saying that you find there is an animal not exactly similar, not even similar to lion and tiger, however, that animal will be very big and having a features trunk. So, in this case, because of the dissimilarity, you can able to identify or cognize that object with that particular name, and you will be conformed to that because it satisfies all the description made by the trustworthy person and relates in addition to your previous experiences. What they said, Nyaya, that the example they have given saying that unlike tiger and lion, elephants have trunk, the example I have given. Further they said unlike dog, fox have no bent tail. So, in this way, because of the dissimilarity, the cognizer is able to cognize that object with a particular name. And the third point, they said that dharma matra upamano is a peculiar property. Dharma means quality, peculiar quality. Therefore, because of the peculiar quality also we could able to identify an object which comes under upamana. What they have explained here is that in this case the objects denoted by a name are described in terms of their peculiar attributes or any combination of attributes which is peculiar to them. The example I have given that a cognizer wishes to know about the squirrel. Here, believing as a trustworthy person to someone ask what is squirrel and how I can identify that animal squirrel. The trustworthy person simply say that the squirrel is an animal, appears to be or look like as a mouse. However, you find the unique feature of the squirrel is there is a stripe on his or her whole body. So, because here is the peculiar quality which is not known to the cognizer earlier. Therefore, they said that this description enables us to discriminate the things denoted by a name from all other things and consequently apply the name to just that class of things. So, this is the three ways we gain the knowledge of a new object, and all these things comes under upamana. Therefore, they say that to have a knowledge on upamana, it is not limited to only similarity, rather it includes dissimilarity as well as peculiar qualities. And because of this similarity, dissimilarity and peculiar qualities, we could able to cognize an object which is not known to you. However, we could able to do that because of some kind of similar objects or similar known facts known to the cognizer. Hope this is clear to you. Now, the example that I have given also the same thing I have written here. Squirrel is a creature which is different from other creatures because his body is filled with strips. Upamana does not correspond to the analogical argument. The point here is very crucial. He is saying that upamana is not same as analogy. The knowledge we gain through upamana, the same thing we cannot gain through the analogy, because they make a distinction between what is upamana and how it is different from analogy. In case of analogy, you find two things are similar. If two things are similar, then you can have an analogy, corresponds with each other. Then you find that whether these two things are similar or not. If I say as an analogy of A and B, that means the features of the A and the features of the B certainly both to be similar. Then only say that you can have an analogy of these two things. But in case of upamana, it is not only similarity but also it includes dissimilarity as well as peculiar qualities. And however, if you notice it that in upamana, certainly the object the cognizer will be cognized not necessarily it will be similar. Certainly some of the other features it will be unique for the cognizer, though majority of the features will be similar to his or her previous experience on the object. However, you find that it is not truly a similar object the person is cognizing. The person is cognizing something unfamiliar object which is not known to him or her earlier, even in his or her earlier experiences. Therefore, you find in case of analogy, it is because of the similarity feature, one person can have said that A and B can have an analogy with each other, and you can get a knowledge of that object. But in case of Opa Mana, it is the similarity, dissimilarity and peculiar qualities a cognizer will cognize an object, and henceforth the knowledge that he or she attained or achieved is known as valid knowledge. The same thing I have written in my slide. If you see that in comparison, we argue as much as from resemblance as from the contrast and peculiarity. However, in analogy, we infer one resemblance from the other resemblance. The page of a book number say 35 and the page of a book number 36, you say that whether all the lines of page number 35 will be found in case of page number 36 or not. This is a kind of resemblance, exactly look like the same. Twin sister, twin brother, in that case you should have analogy. That means if the twin brother name is Hari and Rama, you say that you identify Hari and the same features you find in case of Rama. Therefore, you can have an analogy between these two persons, Hari and Rama. But in case of Opa Mana, you find that Hari is not same with Rama, because Rama has some other features. In case of twins, you cannot have a Opa Mana knowledge. If you want to know, so let us say Hari's elder brother or Hari's cousin, you say that Hari's cousin looks like a Hari, however, some of the other features you find in case of Hari's cousin which is not find in case of a Hari. Now I hope this is clear to you how Nyaya make a distinction between Opa Mana or comparison in analogy. They said that in case of analogy, we infer one resemblance from the other resemblance. In case of comparison, we argue as much from the resemblance as from the contrast and peculiarity. Further, they said Opa Mana does not lead to the resemblance between two things or two objects, but to the denotation of a word to a class of objects. Here, in case of Opa Mana, we are not certainly saying that. In all the cases, similarity, dissimilarity, peculiar qualities, in all the cases, whenever we are identifying an object, this is limited to that object. Rather, we are saying this is a class of objects. I will give the example. If I say that the jackdaw appears to be a crow, however, it is a big in shape and some kind of red color you find in the corner of the feather. Here we are saying that if any kind of jackdaw you find, it is a class of jackdaw. You are not identifying one jackdaw, it is a class of jackdaw you are finding. But in case of analogy, you find a particular object. Hari and Rama is a particular object, page number 35, 36 of a particular book. So therefore, he is saying that the two particular object involved in case of an analogy, however in case of Opa Mana, it denotes to a class of object. In case of dissimilarity also, you find the class of elephants. In case of peculiar qualities, you find in class of whole animals known as squirrel. It is not saying that squirrel 1 or squirrel 2 or squirrel 3, but it is saying that unlike a mouse, a squirrel has a stripes on his or her body. He is saying that any kind of animal appears to these features, you immediately say squirrel. That means you are not identifying a particular object, you are identifying the whole class as such. So in this way, you find the difference between analogy and Opa Mana. Now the question arises, can Opa Mana gives us any valid knowledge? Now you know what is Opa Mana and how Nyaya explain Opa Mana and how Opa Mana based on these three features, similarity, dissimilarity and peculiar quality. Now question arises, can Opa Mana gives us any valid knowledge? Charvaka, as you know that Charvaka are heterodox. They said that perception is the only source of knowledge. If you cannot perceive the particular object, any knowledge you gain it about that object won't be valid knowledge for the cognizer. Therefore, they said that Charvaka rejects the Nyaya views of Opa Mana under three grounds. Because according to Charvaka, perception is the only valid source of knowledge. Whatever you perceive, this is the only valid knowledge for the cognizer. And whatever you cannot perceive through your five sense organs, it cannot be turned to the valid knowledge according to Charvaka. Based on this ground, Charbaka rejects Upamana knowledge as a valid knowledge. What Charbaka is saying that if Nyaya at all considering Upamana in case of only similarity, then why at all there is a two different name altogether. Under the first ground, Charbaka rejects Nyaya Upamana, saying that if Nyayakas mean that to have an Upamana knowledge we must have a two objects which is similar to each other. If this is so, then why at all there is a two different name for two different objects? We can give you one particular name. We can say crow is similar to crow. Why you are saying that crow is not similar to jackdaw? So therefore, under the first ground, similarity ground, Charbaka criticizes Nyaya Upamana. Second ground, they said that semi-similarity. If Nyayakas at all mean by semi-similarity through which we can have a Upamana knowledge, then there are every chances that the cognizer unable to cognize the object which is described by the trustworthy person. There are every chances that the cognizer may fail to cognize that object not in true spirit. The cognizer unable to cognize the gabagai in many of the cases. There are every chances that the cognizer able to cognize the buffalo as a gabagai. So under the semi-similarity concept or the say semi-perfect similarity concept, Charbaka rejects Nyaya. The third point, they said that imperfect similarity. Charbaka said that if Nyayakas mean that because of the imperfect similarity we have a Upamana knowledge, then it is completely wrong. If cow has nothing to do with gabagai, if crow has nothing to do with jackdaw, then how can we cognize, how a cognizer will cognize jackdaw, saying that jackdaw has some kind of similarity to the crow of having the previous experience of that cognizer. So therefore, under these three grounds, similarity, semi-similarity and imperfect similarity, based on these three grounds, Charbaka criticizes Nyaya Upamana. Now Nyaya defends that. They said that it is the misunderstanding of the exact or real nature of Upamana as a method of valid knowledge. What Nyaya is saying that Charbaka fails to understand what we want to speak about the Upamana knowledge, because they are not talking about the degree of Upamana as mentioned by Charbaka. He is saying that we are not really mentioning the degree of Upamana through which one should get the knowledge known as Upamana. Then Charbaka said that there are still possible situations arises where the cognizer may not be able to cognize the object in its true form, because it neither conforms to the similarity nor semi-perfect similarity nor dissimilarity. That means in Upamana knowledge there are every possibility that the cognizer will cognize a different object but by having the same name. A cognizer can cognize a buffalo by having a name gabagai, which may not be the valid knowledge. Now Nyaya defines this. Nyaya said that we are not denying that. What Nyaya said that we are not denying that in Upamana there are possibility where the cognizer not able to cognize the object, not able to cognize the exact object based on the description made by the trust of the person. What they said is that in Upamana we are not arguing that a cognizer may not fail to cognize an object in its true nature. However, Nyaya imposed on Charbaka, saying that in perception also we cognize snake as a rope. Then how it is the case that you accept perception as a valid knowledge where there is every chances that the cognizer fails to cognize an object which is not that object? Still you accept perception as a valid knowledge. Then if this is so, then what is wrong with accepting Upamana as an independent source of valid knowledge as well? So this is the way Nyaya defends Charbaka. They said that Nyaya is now saying we are not denying that Upamana sometimes lead to wrong judgment. For an example, the judgment of a buffalo as a gabagai. But this difficulty is not peculiar to Upamana alone. What they said, even in case of perceptual knowledge, we found the same thing, because we perceive snake instead of rope, yet we are claiming perception is a valid method of knowledge. Further they say, if there is no reason for this, then why should we deny Upamana as a valid pramana? Now whatever Charbaka made against Nyaya that Upamana cannot be considered as an independent source of valid knowledge, Nyaya defends that. Now the question maybe remains, stating that can Upamana be reduced to any other pramana? Buddhists said that, Buddhism is a school of thought. They said that Upamana is a knowledge can be reduced to perception and verbal testimony. Verbal testimony because the trustworthy person describes about that unknown object to the cognizer. And perception means the cognizer perceives the same kind of object in conformity to the trustworthy person's description in the later period of his life. So therefore they say that Upamana can be reduced two kinds of pramana, one is verbal testimony, another is perception. Nyaya rejects Buddhist argument. They are saying that Buddhist as a reductionist, their view cannot be accepted because it is the cognizer who is responsible to cognize that new object based on that description and his earlier experience on a similar kind of object. If the cognizer may not able to recollect all the information on exact time and may not able to impose all the features on a particular object which is presented before him or her, then in any case the cognizer may not able to cognize the object though he has an understanding of the description made by the trustworthy person or experience of the similar kind of object in his or her past life. So therefore they say that it is the individual who is responsible to cognize that object. It is not because of just because of the verbal testimony and the perception. It is his own decision to find out whether he cognizes the object with its true nature or not. Therefore, it cannot be reduced to perception as well as verbal testimony. Further, you find that Sankhya and Vaisheshika, there are two schools. They said that Upamana or a comparison as an independent valid pramana according to Nyaya can be reduced to inference because they have argued in this way. They said that if we will put all animals resembling the cow are gabagai, this is an animal resembling the cow and therefore this is gabagai. Here it is an inference or a anumana where you find that the middle term and the major term both are having a vyapta relation. So he is saying that here we find an essential component of inference is known as vyapta relation and all the features of the inference is satisfying and therefore there we can reduce the Upamana to be an inferential knowledge. But here Nyaya said that to have an inference we need a few propositions, 3 propositions or sometimes 5 propositions. However, if in case of Upamana you find more than these propositions because whenever the trustworthy person describes to a cognizer to an unknown object for the cognizer, he describes so much thing about that unknown object and further also brings some kind of similarity, dissimilarity and peculiar qualities in reference to his or her previous experience on similar kind of object. Therefore, it cannot be reduced to inferential knowledge. And whenever the person describes towards an unknown object to the cognizer, certainly does not satisfy the vyapta relation, whatever the statement he made it. Therefore, Nyaya said that in Upamana we are considering many propositions denoted to an object and here we are comparing the objects but not infer. Whenever we have a knowledge in Upamana we are comparing whether through similarity, whether through dissimilarity or whether through peculiar qualities, but we are not inferring to a situation or we are not inferring to an object. So I hope now it is understood to you how Nyaya explains and defends other schools saying that Upamana or comparison is an independent source of valid knowledge as like perception or pratyekya, inference or anumana. In the next class we will be discussing verbal testimony as an independent source of valid knowledge according to Nyaya philosophy. Thank you.